They didn't tell me to leave. They didn't raise their voices. They just said, "You're grown now. You can handle things on your own." My tools were stacked in a metal bin behind the gas station. Old files, certificates, things I worked years for treated like leftovers after a shift ended. My mother stood nearby, calm, explaining to someone off camera how this was for the best. People watched. Some nodded. No one asked me anything. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just realized something terrifying being independent had become the excuse to erase me. If this sounds familiar, stay with me. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe, because this story isn't about leaving home. It's about what happens when the truth finally shows up. The part no one talks about comes after the moment everyone remembers. Not the shock, not the words, but what happens when your body realizes it's no longer safe. After that day, nothing dramatic followed me home. There was no screaming in my head, no breakdown in a parking lot. I just noticed small things changing, quiet things I couldn't explain without sounding dramatic, so I didn't try. I started waking up earlier than I needed to, not because I was productive, because my body wouldn't let me sleep in. Every sound outside felt closer than it should have. A door closing 2 houses down, tires on gravel, the hum of a truck idling too long. I'd sit up in bed before my mind caught up, heart already racing, like I'd missed something important. I'd told myself it was temporary. I'd told myself everyone feels unsettled after a fight. But this wasn't a fight. It was the feeling that the place that taught me how to breathe had quietly decided it no longer would. I noticed it most when I walked into familiar spaces, places that used to feel neutral, safe by default. A kitchen, a hallway, a room where nothing bad had ever happened before. My chest would tighten anyway. Have you ever walked into a room you know well and still felt like you were trespassing? I kept replaying the same thought, over and over. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should have handled it better. Maybe I really was asking for too much. That was the worst part. Not the fear, the self-correction. Every time my body reacted, my mind stepped in to apologize for it. I started flinching at kindness. When someone asked if I was okay, my first instinct was to say yes too fast. When someone offered help, I felt embarrassed for needing it, like safety was something I'd already used up my share of. I stopped leaving things out in the open, papers, tools, notes. I stacked everything neatly, out of sight. I didn't want anything that looked like it belonged to me to be too visible. It's strange how quickly you learn to disappear when being seen once cost you everything. I didn't tell anyone this part, not at first, because it sounds small when you say it out loud. I'm jumpy, I'm tired, I just need time. But what I was really learning was a new rule. Comfort can be revoked without warning. That rule gets into your bones. I caught myself scanning faces more than usual, listening for tone shifts, waiting for the moment someone would decide I'd crossed an invisible line. It made me quiet, careful, polite in ways that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with survival. And the whole time, I kept asking myself the same question. If this is what home can turn into, where am I supposed to rest? No one teaches you how to grieve a place that still exists, because the house didn't disappear. The walls were still there. The routines went on. From the outside, everything looked normal. That made it harder, not easier. There was nothing obvious to point to and say, that's when it broke. Just a slow understanding settling in. The loss wasn't my things. It wasn't even the words. It was the feeling of being protected that vanished without ceremony. When the people who are supposed to stand between you and the world step aside, You don't suddenly become stronger. You become alert. You become guarded. You become very good at holding your breath. I started blaming myself for that too. Why can't I just move on? Why am I still reacting? Why does this feel bigger than it should? Because it was bigger. It wasn't about a single moment. It was about trust quietly collapsing. And trust doesn't fall loudly. It erodes, one reaction at a time, one night of shallow sleep, one apology you didn't need to make but did anyway. I wish someone had told me this then. You don't need to forget to heal. You don't need to minimize it. You don't need to be grateful it wasn't worse. Your body remembers what your mouth won't say. And it remembers especially well when safety is taken away by the people who taught you what safety was supposed to feel like. There's a kind of grief that comes with that. Not loud, not cinematic, just a constant, low hum of caution running under everything you do. I carried that hum with me for a long time, until one day, I stopped asking myself how to go back and started asking a different question instead. If safety isn't guaranteed, what does it look like to build it myself? That question didn't bring relief right away, but it did something else. It gave the fear somewhere to go. Because growing up isn't pretending nothing hurt. Growing up is realizing that safety isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose to protect. People kept saying the same thing after that. You're strong. You'll be fine. You've always been independent. They meant it as comfort. I could tell. But every time I heard it, something tightened in my chest. Because independence was being used like a conclusion, like a door quietly closing. I had learned to take care of myself early. I paid my own bills. I handled my own problems. I didn't ask for much. That part was true. But somewhere along the way, that turned into an assumption that I no longer needed anything at all. Not fairness, not protection, not accountability. Just because I could stand on my own didn't mean I stopped being affected by what happened around me. It just meant I got better at absorbing it quietly. I noticed how often people confused capability with consent. If you can manage, then you should manage. If you didn't fall apart, then it must not have hurt that much. If you survived, then no one owed you an explanation. Have you ever realized that the very thing you're praised for becomes the reason people feel justified walking away? I replayed certain moments differently once I saw it. Conversations that had sounded reasonable at the time, decisions that were framed as giving me space, responsibilities that were suddenly mine alone without discussion. No one said, "We're stepping back." They said, "You've got this." And because I had always had it, I didn't question when having it turned into being left with it. There's a quiet kind of abandonment that hides behind compliments. It doesn't look like rejection. It looks like trust. It looks like respect. It looks like someone finally believing you're capable. But capability doesn't cancel out impact. I could hold a job and still be shaken. I could pay rent and still feel unsafe. I could function and still be alone. Those things can exist at the same time. I started noticing how responsibility shifted without acknowledgement. When things went wrong, it was assumed I would handle it. When things were decided, I was informed after. When lines were crossed, it was framed as misunderstanding instead of harm. Because I was grown, I asked myself a question I hadn't wanted to ask before. If I wasn't invisible, why did no one check in when it mattered? If independence meant freedom, why did it feel like it only came with consequences? I remembered standing in front of the fridge one night, staring at shelves that were mostly empty. Not because I couldn't fill them, but because it felt symbolic. Like proof that everything I needed was technically available, just not shared. I ate standing up. I didn't sit down. I didn't want to settle into the space. It didn't feel earned or offered. That's when it hit me. Independence had been used to withdraw responsibility without saying so out loud. No meeting, no boundary conversation, just a gradual retreat, masked as confidence in me. And the problem with that kind of retreat is that it leaves no one accountable when things fall apart. If you're independent, then you're responsible. If you're responsible, then you can't complain. If you complain, then you're ungrateful. That logic traps you in silence. I felt myself editing my reactions, making sure they were appropriate, making sure they didn't sound needy, making sure I didn't ask questions that would make someone uncomfortable. I didn't want to look like I was failing at adulthood, so I stayed quiet, and being quiet made everything easier for everyone else. That's the part no one warns you about. When you're the capable one, your pain becomes inconvenient. It disrupts the story people tell themselves about you, the story where you're fine, the story where stepping back was the right choice, the story where nothing was taken from you, only handed over, but nothing was handed over. Responsibility was dropped, support was removed, and independence was the label used to make it sound generous. I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't been able to cope as well, if I had broken down, if I had needed more. Would that have forced a different response? Or would it have just changed the narrative to something less flattering? I didn't have the answer yet. All I knew was that independence didn't protect me. It just made it easier for people to assume I didn't need protection in the first place. And once that assumption settles in, it's very hard to undo. I looked at my notes that night. Pages of things I'd written down without realizing why. Dates, conversations, decisions that didn't quite add up. I didn't know yet what they would become. I just knew I needed evidence of my own experience. Something solid, something that couldn't be dismissed as emotion. Because emotions are easy to ignore. Evidence is not. That was the moment the story shifted for me. Not outwardly. Nothing changed on the surface, but internally, something settled. I stopped trying to prove I was okay and started paying attention to what had actually happened, because independence shouldn't make you invisible. And if it does, the problem isn't your strength. It's what other people chose to step away from once they decided you could survive without them. The consequences of that choice hadn't shown up yet, but they were coming. It happened on a weekday afternoon, the kind of afternoon where nothing important is supposed to happen. The sun was high, but the heat felt heavy, like it was pressing everything down. The air around the station smelled like oil, dust, and something burnt that never really goes away. I remember being tired before I even understood why they had asked me to come by. They said they were clearing out the back, just organizing, making room. Those were the words they used. I didn't think much of it at first. That was my mistake. When I pulled into the lot, I noticed the bins before I noticed anything else. Large metal containers, lined up neatly near the storage door. Too neat, too intentional. Like they had been placed there earlier, waiting. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up. My things were already inside, not thrown in, placed. Tools I had bought one piece at a time. Folders with my name written small in the corner. Old notebooks with bent covers and grease stains on the edges. Things that looked ordinary to anyone else, but represented years of effort to me. Everything was stacked carefully, like someone wanted it to look reasonable. I stood there for a second, not moving, trying to understand when this decision had been made, because it clearly hadn't been made with me. That's when I noticed the camera above the door. The security camera had always been there. I'd walked under it 100 times without thinking, but this time, I could feel it. The angle, the quiet certainty that it was recording everything. I looked away too quickly. Then I saw the phone. Someone had propped it up against a crate near the edge of the lot. The screen was facing outward, not toward me, toward the road, toward anyone passing by. The red light was on. That was the moment I understood this wasn't private. People slowed down as they walked past. Some stopped completely. Some pretended to be busy while watching from the corner of their eye. A couple of trucks lingered longer than necessary. No one spoke to me directly. They spoke around me. She's been independent for a while now. She doesn't really need this space anymore. We're just trying to keep things organized. The words were calm, measured, reasonable. That made them harder to push back against. No one asked what I wanted to keep. No one asked if I needed time. No one explained what would happen next. I heard my name said like it was a category, like it explained everything on its own. I picked up a box without realizing I was doing it. It was heavier than it looked. My hands shook slightly, and I felt embarrassed by that. I adjusted my grip, hoping no one noticed. The camera blinked steadily. If you were me, would you have said something? I thought about it. I really did. But I knew that anything I said would be recorded, cropped, replayed, labeled. Silence could be interpreted however people wanted, but words could be twisted into something worse. When cameras are involved, there's no neutral reaction. If you speak up, you're defensive. If you get angry, you're unstable. If you cry, you're dramatic. And if you stay quiet, people assume you agree. I stayed quiet. Someone laughed from across the lot, not loudly, just enough to register. Someone else shook their head, the way people do when they think they're watching a necessary correction being made. I caught my reflection in the office window. I looked smaller than I remembered, not because I was shrinking, but because everything around me had grown louder and more solid. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a presentation. The phone captured one version of the moment. The security camera captured another, both incomplete, both powerful enough to shape a story I didn't get to tell. I moved slowly, choosing what to take out of the bins and what to leave behind. Every choice felt exposed, like someone could judge my priorities based on what I reached for first. I noticed how careful I was with my body, how I avoided blocking the camera, how I stepped aside when someone walked too close. I was already adjusting myself to fit into the frame. That realization hurt more than anything else. Public humiliation doesn't need yelling. It doesn't need threats. It just needs an audience. An audience turns discomfort into pressure. Pressure turns hesitation into compliance. I didn't ask them to stop recording. I knew that question would become its own clip. I focused on breathing, on not dropping anything, on keeping my face neutral. I didn't want to give them a reaction they could keep. The bins filled faster than I expected. Years of work reduced to containers meant for scrap. When it was done, there was no closing statement, no explanation, just people drifting away, satisfied, like they had witnessed something conclude properly. The phone stayed on a few seconds longer, long enough to catch me turning away. That image stayed with me. Not the words, not the laughter. The fact that my silence had been recorded and stored like evidence. Later that night, I watched part of the video. I told myself I wouldn't. I was lying. Curiosity sharpens when your own life becomes something other people comment on. The comments came fast. People filling in gaps they didn't understand, deciding who I was based on a few minutes of footage. Most of them agreed on one thing. I looked fine. That was what hurt, because fine is convenient. Fine means no one has to ask questions. Fine means the situation can be closed and moved on from. I hadn't cried. I hadn't argued. I hadn't interrupted the narrative, so the narrative ran without me. That's how violence works now. Not with hands, with framing. You don't have to hit someone to take something from them. You just have to control how the moment is seen. Once a camera is on, the truth becomes optional. What matters is what gets captured and what gets left out. And I had been left out of my own story. I went home feeling hollow, not angry yet, not fully sad, just aware that something had shifted into a place I couldn't reach easily. I sat on the edge of my bed with one of the notebooks in my lap. The cover was bent, but the pages inside were fine. I opened it and didn't write anything. I just held it there, because for the first time, I understood what I was up against. This wasn't about space. It wasn't about independence. It was about control over which version of events would stick. And once that version is out there, it creates consequences. I didn't know what those consequences would look like yet, but I knew they wouldn't be small. The cameras had already decided that. The story didn't end when the cameras turned off. That was just when it started spreading. I noticed it in small ways at first. Messages that didn't get answered, calls that went straight to voicemail, conversations that felt shorter than they used to, like people were already halfway out before I finished speaking. I told myself it was coincidence. Then an email came back with no explanation, then another. The language was polite, vague. We've decided to move in a different direction. This isn't the right fit right now. No details, no feedback, just distance. I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know how far it had gone. It didn't take long to figure it out. Someone had shared the video. Someone always does. In a small town, things don't need to go viral to go everywhere. They just need to land in the right group chat. The version of the story that spread wasn't complicated. I was difficult. I was unstable. I was someone who had outstayed her welcome and didn't know when to leave. That was enough. People didn't ask me what happened. They didn't check in. They didn't question the framing. They trusted what they saw first. And once a story arrives fully formed, most people don't feel the need to investigate it. Have you ever realized you're being judged without being present? I would walk into a room and feel it immediately. A pause, a shift in tone. Someone suddenly remembering something they needed to do somewhere else. I wasn't confronted. I was avoided. That was worse. I watched opportunities disappear quietly, not with conflict, with silence, with closed doors that were never slammed hard enough to point at. I sent out applications anyway, followed up, stayed professional. I did everything you're supposed to do when you're trying not to look like a problem. But problems don't need proof to stick. They just need repetition. I started seeing the pattern. If the first version of the story paints you as unreliable, everything you do afterward is interpreted through that lens. Effort becomes desperation. Silence becomes guilt. Confidence becomes arrogance. There's no clean way out once that framing settles. I kept a notebook during that time. I didn't know why at first. I just wrote things down. Dates, names, what was said, what wasn't. Not feelings, facts. Because feelings were already being used against me. I was alone in that process. Completely. No one offered context. No one gave me a chance to explain. I wasn't asked to defend myself because, in their minds, there was nothing to defend. The story had already done the work. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, staring at my phone, wondering if I should say something publicly, post my side, clarify, correct the record. I typed out a message, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. What would I even say? Anything emotional would confirm the image they already had. Anything factual would look defensive. And once you're defending yourself to an audience that didn't ask for clarification, you've already lost. So I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, because I understood how easily words could be turned into evidence against me. That silence came with consequences. People assumed it meant the story was true. They assumed I had something to hide, that I was embarrassed, that I was ashamed. They didn't consider that I was calculating. Every day felt heavier, not in a dramatic way, in a practical one. Bills still had to be paid. Groceries still needed to be bought. Life kept moving while my name quietly narrowed into something less welcome. I learned how fast credibility can disappear when no one thinks it belongs to you anymore. I also learned how comfortable people are believing the first thing that lets them feel aligned with the majority. No one wants to be the person who asks, "What if we're wrong?" Because that question requires responsibility, and responsibility is inconvenient. I stopped expecting fairness from conversations. I stopped expecting curiosity. I stopped expecting anyone to hold space for complexity. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me focused, because if emotion wasn't going to change the narrative, something else had to. I looked at my notebook differently then, not as a place to vent, as a record, a timeline, something solid. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I just knew that if the story being told about me wasn't true, then eventually, the truth would need something stronger than my word to stand on. The first version of a story has power. It shapes reactions. It sets expectations. It creates consequences long before facts arrive. I was living inside those consequences. And the hardest part was knowing that none of this required anyone to lie outright. All they had to do was tell the story first. I didn't correct them. I didn't challenge them. I waited. Because if you're going to confront a story that's already been accepted, you don't do it with emotion. You do it with evidence. And I was still collecting mine. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. It came quietly, on a morning that looked like every other morning. I was tired. I hadn't slept well. The fridge was mostly empty again, and I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it like it might explain something to me. That's when my phone buzzed. Not a message. An email. The subject line didn't sound important. It almost made me skip it. I opened it anyway. It wasn't about the video. Not directly. It was about paperwork. Old paperwork. Something I hadn't thought about in years. A name I recognized immediately was mentioned. Someone connected to my grandfather. Someone I hadn't heard from since before everything fell apart. They asked if I was aware of a trust. I read that line 3 times. Not a will. Not an inheritance story. A trust. I didn't reply right away. I sat down instead. The chair felt harder than usual. My hands were cold. Even though the room was warm, I had been told there was nothing left. That everything had already been handled, that I didn't need to worry about it. I believed that. I had no reason not to. I answered the email carefully, just enough to ask what they meant. The response came later that day. There were attachments, PDFs, dates, signatures, language I didn't fully understand yet, but recognized as official, not emotional, not interpretive. Concrete. The trust had been set up years ago, not recently, long before anyone told me I was independent enough, long before the cameras, long before the story about me was decided, and my name was on it. Not as a suggestion, not as a possibility, as a beneficiary. I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized was clenched. I didn't feel excited. That surprised me. I thought I would. What I felt was steady. For the first time in a long time, something didn't rely on my memory or my word. It existed whether anyone believed me or not. I read through everything slowly, Then again, then a third time. I wrote notes in the margins. Dates lined up. Decisions matched the gaps I'd felt but couldn't explain. There were conditions. 2. Not dramatic ones. Practical ones. Rules about management, about misuse, about accountability. That part stood out. The system wasn't built to argue with anyone. It didn't need to. If certain actions were taken, certain consequences followed. Automatically. No raised voices, no explanations, no justifications, just outcomes. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. If you were me, what would you have done next? I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't post anything. I knew better by then. I contacted the person who sent the email and asked for clarification. Then I contacted someone else. And then someone else. Quietly, methodically. Each conversation added weight. Every answer confirmed the same thing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. Information had been withheld. Control had been maintained. And it had all been done cleanly enough that no one expected me to question it. Until now. I thought about all the moments I'd been told to handle it myself. All the times independence had been used as a reason to step back. All the times I'd been made to feel unreasonable for asking questions. None of that mattered here. This wasn't about feelings. This was about structure. I realized something important then. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be solid. Everything before this had been noise, opinions, reactions, interpretations. People choosing which version of events felt most convenient. This wasn't that. This was a system that didn't care how calm someone sounded on camera, or how convincing a story was, or how many people nodded along. It cared about records. I started organizing my notes differently after that. Not as a journal, as a timeline. I lined up what I had experienced with what existed on paper. The gaps disappeared. For the first time, I could see the full shape of what had happened without filling in the blanks myself. I didn't feel the need to defend my reactions anymore, or explain why things had affected me the way they did. The evidence explained it better than I ever could. I also understood why no one had expected me to find this, because most people don't go looking for structure when they're busy surviving. They count on that. I thought about how many times I'd been told to calm down, to let it go, to move forward. How easily emotion is dismissed when it's inconvenient. This couldn't be dismissed. It didn't raise its voice. It didn't argue back. It just existed. And existence has consequences. I didn't know yet what would happen once this moved out of my hands and into the system it belonged to. But I knew one thing. For the first time since all of this started, I wasn't waiting to be believed. I didn't need anyone's permission to tell my story, because the story had already been written somewhere more permanent. And once the truth has a shape, it doesn't need anyone to defend it. It does the work on its own. Not everyone ends up where I did. That's something I had to admit to myself. Some people grow up in difficult families and still manage to leave without scars that follow them into every room. Some people hear harsh words and recognize them early for what they are. I didn't. What I thought was normal was already a warning. It usually doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with small permissions being taken away, conversations you're not invited into, decisions being made for your own good. At first, it feels like care. I remember being told, "We didn't want to stress you out." That sounded kind, responsible, loving. But no one asked if I wanted to be protected by silence. Have you ever noticed how often control disguises itself as concern? Another sign came later. Every time I disagreed, the issue stopped being about what I said and became about how I said it. My tone, my timing, my attitude. The subject always shifted away from the actual problem. That's when I started doubting myself. I learned to rehearse conversations in my head before speaking. I chose my words carefully. I edited my reactions. I thought that if I could just communicate better, things would feel safer. They didn't. Because safety isn't something you earn by behaving correctly. It's something that's given freely, or not at all. There were other signs I ignored, boundaries that were laughed at. Privacy that wasn't respected but was explained away as family doesn't keep secrets. My phone was checked. My plans were questioned. My independence was praised publicly and punished privately. I didn't see the contradiction at the time. I thought that was just how families stayed close. Looking back, closeness wasn't the goal. Access was. Another thing I wish I had recognized sooner was how accountability never flowed upward. Mistakes were always mine. Hurt feelings were always oversensitivity. Apologies, when they came, were vague, conditional. I'm sorry you took it that way. Nothing ever changed after them. If you're always the one adjusting, apologizing, explaining, that's not compromise. That's training. I didn't think of it like that then. I thought I was being mature. There's a difference between being strong and being silent. I confused the two for a long time. One of the clearest signs, though, was how my success made people uncomfortable. Not openly, subtly. Compliments followed by jokes. Support followed by reminders of where I came from. It was never allowed to belong fully to me. Any progress had to be framed as temporary, fragile, dependent on their generosity. That kept me small without ever saying the word. And when I struggled, that framing flipped instantly. See, this is why you need us. If you've heard that sentence in different forms your whole life, you start to believe that independence is something you're borrowing, not building. I also didn't notice how often my feelings were used as evidence against me. If I was calm, I was cold. If I was emotional, I was unstable. There was no version of my response that didn't support someone else's narrative. That's when I started feeling alone, even in crowded rooms. Not because no one was around, but because no one was listening without an agenda. I want to be clear about something. Toxicity doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve shouting or obvious harm. Sometimes it looks like constant justification, like having to explain your choices to people who have already decided you're wrong. Sometimes it looks like being praised for your resilience while no one asks why you had to become resilient in the first place. If you're watching this and thinking, that sounds familiar, it doesn't mean your family is evil. It doesn't mean you need to cut anyone off tomorrow. It means something deserves your attention. The earlier you notice patterns, the less damage they do. I didn't notice until consequences forced me to, until silence became louder than arguments, until distance felt safer than proximity. By then, a lot had already been lost. You don't need a dramatic moment to validate your discomfort. You don't need proof of harm to trust your instincts. If your boundaries are consistently treated as inconveniences, that's information. If your independence is celebrated only when it benefits someone else, that's information. If your pain is minimized unless it can be used as leverage, that's information. What you do with that information is your choice. I didn't act on it early. I kept hoping things would settle, that people would self-correct. They didn't. Because people rarely change dynamics that work in their favor. Recognizing toxicity isn't about assigning blame, it's about clarity. Clarity gives you options, and options give you agency. I wish I had understood that before things went as far as they did. Before evidence became necessary. Before consequences became unavoidable. But understanding it now still mattered. Because once you can name a pattern, it loses some of its power. You stop wondering if you're imagining things. You stop asking for permission to feel unsettled. And that awareness, quiet as it is, becomes the beginning of something different, something unfinished, something I hadn't decided how to handle yet, but I was no longer blind to it. And that changed everything. The first sign wasn't anger, it was panic. My phone started lighting up in a way it never had before. Missed calls stacked on top of each other, messages sent, deleted, then sent again. The tone shifted fast, not accusatory, urgent. I didn't answer right away. I was at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd organized my notes and documents. The notebook was open, the papers were neatly stacked. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic, but something had started moving. What I didn't do matters here. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't post anything online. All I had done was let the system do what it was designed to do. That was enough. The messages came in waves. First confusion, then reassurance, then bargaining, then fear. They asked what I was doing. They asked who I'd talked to. They asked why I hadn't come to them first. No one asked if I was okay. I noticed that. If you were me, what would you have said back? I chose not to explain, not because I wanted revenge, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Explanation is a privilege you give people who listen. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about proving I was right. It was about not being erased. I thought back to all the moments I'd been told my role was temporary, that I was helped, that my place was conditional. This was the opposite of that. This was permanent, documented, enforced. And it didn't care how anyone felt about it. The pressure increased when they realized I wasn't engaging emotionally. They tried different angles: concern, nostalgia, reminders of family history. They talked about stress, about misunderstandings, about how things had gotten out of hand. They still didn't talk about facts. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, because misunderstandings collapse when clarity shows up. This didn't. I set boundaries instead. Simple ones. I said I would communicate through proper channels. I said everything would be handled formally. I said nothing else. That silence did more than any argument ever could. People think power looks like dominance, like control, like volume. It doesn't. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be pulled back into a story that was never told in good faith. I could feel the shift in how they spoke to me. Less certainty, more caution. They weren't talking to the version of me they'd defined anymore. They were talking to someone they couldn't control. That frightened them, not because they were losing money or reputation, because they were losing authorship. For years, my identity had been shaped by what others said about me, who I was, what I deserved, how much space I could take up. Now there were limits they couldn't cross without consequences. Real ones. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was grounded. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was responding. Every move I made was deliberate, recorded, quiet. I didn't rush. I didn't escalate. I didn't seek validation. I let time do its work. There's a moment when people realize the usual tools don't apply anymore. That emotional leverage won't move anything. That guilt won't soften boundaries. That moment is uncomfortable to watch, but it's necessary. I was accused of being cold. That was fine. I'd been called worse when I was quiet and compliant. At least now, the quiet had structure behind it. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge needs an audience. Revenge needs reaction. This needed neither. It was about recognition, about restoring something that had been taken without permission. I didn't want them to suffer. I wanted the truth to stand where their version used to be. And the truth didn't need me to defend it. It already had shape. There were consequences. Yes, but they weren't dramatic. They were procedural. Financial, reputational. They came without yelling. That's the kind that lasts. I thought about how many people confuse boundaries with cruelty, how often someone standing still is seen as an attack. This wasn't cruelty, this was self-preservation. I wasn't trying to win. I was making sure I couldn't be erased again. By the time things settled, the tone of the messages changed completely. Shorter, careful, formal. They knew the rules now, and so did I. I didn't feel the need to say, "See, I told you." I didn't need an apology. What mattered was that the story could no longer move without me in it, that my name was no longer optional, that my existence was no longer something that could be edited out when it became inconvenient. This wasn't revenge. It was refusal. Refusal to disappear quietly. Refusal to be rewritten. Refusal to play the role that had been assigned to me. And once that refusal was in place, everything else followed. Not loudly, but permanently. I didn't go back. Not to the gas station. Not to the house. Not to the version of myself that learned how to survive by shrinking. That part surprised people. They expected a reunion, a confrontation, some dramatic moment where everything was said out loud and wrapped up neatly. That didn't happen. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger had done its job already. It pushed me to see clearly. It gave me momentum when I needed it. But I didn't carry it with me. What I carried was something quieter. Clarity. I moved into a small place where no one knew my story. The fridge wasn't full, but it was mine. The silence felt different there. Not tense. Not watchful. Just quiet. The first few weeks were strange. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for a voice to question my decisions, for someone to tell me I was being irresponsible. No one did. And that's when I realized how much energy I had spent proving I deserved space. If you were me, would you have noticed that right away I didn't hate anyone? That's important to say. Hate would have kept me tied to a version of the story I was trying to leave. Hate still needs the other person to exist at the center of your choices. I didn't want that. What I wanted was a place where my reality didn't need defending, where my memories weren't challenged, where my boundaries weren't treated like inconveniences. That became my definition of safety. Growing up, I thought maturity meant tolerating discomfort without complaint, keeping the peace, being the reasonable one. I thought if I could endure more, things would eventually balance out. They didn't. What I learned instead was that endurance without limits isn't strength. It's erosion. You don't become more adult by accepting less respect. You don't become wiser by ignoring patterns that hurt you. You don't become stronger by staying where your name can be erased. I still think about that sometimes. How easily I confused patience with self-abandonment. No one taught me the difference. And maybe that's the hardest part of growing up. Realizing that some lessons aren't passed down. They're discovered after damage has already been done. I didn't rebuild my life overnight. There was no montage. No sudden success. There were ordinary days. Work, groceries, quiet evenings. The slow process of trusting my own judgment again. That trust mattered more than anything else. Because once you trust yourself, manipulation loses its grip. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had already decided how they felt about them. I stopped volunteering context to those who used it selectively. I chose where to place my energy. That choice alone changed everything. Sometimes I get asked if I regret how things ended. I don't. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because it was honest. I didn't rewrite the past. I didn't deny what happened. I didn't pretend it didn't hurt. I just stopped letting it define the future. If you're listening to this and seeing parts of yourself in it, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to wait for things to become unbearable before taking yourself seriously. You don't need permission to want safety. You don't owe loyalty to anyone who requires you to disappear to keep the peace. Growing up isn't about learning how to endure more pain. It's about learning when to walk away from it. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I chose. And that choice was enough. If this story resonated with you, if it put words to something you felt but never said out loud, you're not alone in that. And if you want to keep exploring these kinds of stories, the quiet ones, the complicated ones, feel free to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Not for drama, but for clarity. Because sometimes, clarity is the most powerful ending there is.